Late on a February night in 1998, Jerusalem's downtown buzzed with the usual mix of youth and nightlife. 17-year-old Noa Eyal and her friend stepped out of a movie theater near Davidka Square, the city's central bus junction. It was close to midnight. Noa, a bright high school senior, was eager to get home to the Ramot neighborhood on Jerusalem's outskirts. But as fate would have it, she missed the last bus. Determined not to be stranded, Noa decided to catch a ride, a fairly common practice in late 90s Israel, where hitchhiking, locally known as tremping, was something many teens did despite the risks. She waved goodbye to her friend, who boarded his own bus and waited by the curb. Moments later, a white car pulled up. Relieved at the prospect of getting home, Noa climbed in. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Noa Eyal and her close friend Eldad headed to Jerusalem's Cinematheque to catch a late movie. Noa, a responsible and fun-loving teen, lived with her family in Ramot, a suburban neighborhood perched on a hillside at the northwestern edge of the city. The plan was simple: enjoy the film and then bus home together partway. Eldad would continue on to his home in Ma'al Adumim, a town just outside Jerusalem, and Noa would ride the same bus until it reached Ramot. Everything went as planned until just before midnight. After the movie, the pair walked to the bus stop at Kikar Davidka Square, in the city centre. This busy square, named after an old mortar artifact on display, was a common transfer point for late-night buses. It was a familiar area for teenagers out on the town. Under the orange glow of streetlights, Noa and Eldad said their goodbyes around 11:55 p.m. Eldad's bus to Ma'al Adumim pulled in, and he climbed aboard, assuming Noa's bus would be right behind. From the window of his bus, Eldad caught a fleeting glimpse of Noa. She was running toward a different bus than the one she'd originally intended to take. Perhaps, he thought, she decided on an alternate route home, or maybe she was just checking if it went her way. In reality, this sighting would later puzzle investigators. Noa never actually boarded any bus that night. It's believed she was trying to catch one, but missed it, and then returned to wait for another option to Ramot. Now alone at the nearly deserted bus stop, Noa was in a predicament familiar to many city teens. The last scheduled bus to her neighborhood had likely left. It's worth noting for context, in the late 90s, many Israelis, especially young people and soldiers, often hitchhiked or caught rides with strangers due to gaps in late-night public transport. While generally safe, it wasn't without danger, and Noa's case would soon underscore the risks. In fact, in the aftermath of what happened, Israeli newspapers would run headlines about the dangers of hitchhiking, highlighting Noa's tragic story. Back at Davidka Square around midnight, Noa must have been anxious to get home. As she waited, a car approached. One key witness, a taxi driver cruising the area for fares, later recalled seeing a young girl getting into a white Ford Escort car with tinted windows and multiple bumper stickers, including a sticker of the Golani Brigade, an Israeli army unit. This was an unusual level of detail, suggesting the taxi driver had a keen eye. White Ford Escort, darkened windows, stickers on the back. He noted one sticker in particular, the emblem of the Golani Infantry Brigade, a common decal for veterans of that unit. We can imagine Noa, cold and tired, gratefully accepting the ride from the driver of that white car. Perhaps he looked harmless enough. Maybe a young man in a baseball cap, another detail that would emerge later. The car headed off into the night with Noa inside. Where exactly it went from downtown was unknown at the time, but what we do know is that Noa never made it home. When sunrise came on February 23, 1998, and Noa hadn't returned, her parents immediately sensed something was wrong. This was completely out of character. Noa was a responsible girl who would call if plans changed. The Eyal family contacted the police and also began searching on their own, rallying friends and neighbors. Panic and dread grew with each passing hour. Jerusalem was not immune to crime, but a missing teen was every parent's nightmare. That afternoon and evening, search parties fanned out. Among them were Noah's high school classmates, who refused to go home until they found their friend. Their worst fears materialized by that evening. In the wooded hills of Ramot Forest, not far from Noah's own neighborhood, a group of her friends stumbled upon a horrific scene. There, amid the trees and underbrush, lay Noah's body. Noah had been sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. Police and rescue services were called to the remote spot. Investigators noted signs of extreme violence. Later reports would detail that her skull had been crushed with a blunt object, indicating a vicious attack. The location was eerily close to home. Ramot Forest is adjacent to the residential area where Noah lived, a place she likely thought safe. The killer had driven her to a dark, secluded area mere minutes from her house and committed unspeakable acts. Noah's family, who had been holding out hope she was just lost or even accidentally stuck somewhere, were confronted with the unthinkable reality of her loss. Jerusalem was stunned. This kind of heinous crime against a young girl sent a chilling message. A predator was on the loose. As news spread, parents hugged their children tighter, and many teens were abruptly forbidden from hitchhiking ever again. Law enforcement immediately formed a special task force to hunt the perpetrator. The case fell to the Jerusalem Police Central Unit, Yamar, which handles serious crimes. Seasoned investigators arrived at the forest crime scene, determined to collect every shred of evidence that might lead to the killer. What clues did the murderer leave behind? In those first hours, police gathered what they could. Forensic teams combed the site in Ramot Forest inch by inch. They documented the condition of Noah's body and any physical evidence. Notably, they recovered biological samples, including the attacker's DNA, from Noah's body. This would prove crucial, though not immediately. DNA profiling was a promising new tool in the late 1990s, and Israel's crime labs were already using it. However, having DNA evidence is only half the battle. It's useful only if you have a suspect to compare it to, or a database match. In 1998, Israel's national DNA database was still relatively small, containing mainly samples from convicted criminals. At that moment, the DNA profile from Noah's killer didn't match anyone on record. It would be like knowing the killer's fingerprint, but having no matching print to compare, an invaluable clue, just waiting for the right connection. Aside from DNA, there were frustratingly few leads. The forest yielded no discarded weapon or personal items. Investigators didn't find Noah's missing personal belongings. Perhaps the killer took a trophy. Police suspected the murderer stole an item from her that night, though searches failed to locate it. One early break appeared to be the taxi driver's account of a white Ford Escort with Golani stickers picking up a girl at Davidka Square. This was a solid lead. Police had a vehicle description and even a military unit sticker. If they could find that car, they might find the killer. Detectives canvassed the area for anyone else who might have seen that car or the driver. They even created composite sketches based on any vague descriptions of a man in the area that night. Though without a clear view of the suspect, these sketches were of limited use. From the get-go, media interest in the case was intense. A brutal rape murder of a teenager in Jerusalem was headline news, and the public was clamoring for answers. Police imposed a media gag order on many details, a common practice in Israel meant to protect the integrity of the investigation. Despite this, a local Jerusalem newspaper defied the gag order and published leaked details, including that very specific description of the car with stickers. This unauthorized leak infuriated investigators. They later said such reports hindered their work and may have helped the killer evade capture. If the murderer read the papers, he would know exactly what police were looking for and could alter his appearance, ditch the car, or remove those distinctive stickers. In fact, the task force suspected that the publicity forced the culprit to destroy evidence and lay low. It was a bitter lesson in how well-intentioned information can backfire during an active manhunt. Jerusalem's police threw themselves headlong into the investigation. This was more than just another case. It felt personal. Many of the officers had children of their own. The city's sense of security had been shaken, and the pressure to solve Noa's murder was immense. Hundreds of people were interviewed in the weeks and months following the crime. Everyone who had been anywhere near downtown Jerusalem or Ramot that night and might have seen something was questioned. Over 50 potential suspects were arrested in the initial phase, as police chased every possible lead. These included known sex offenders, violent criminals, or anyone whose name came up even vaguely connected to similar crimes. Each arrest raised hopes, only to dash them when DNA or alibis didn't pan out. Investigators traveled the country checking on owners of white Ford Escorts matching the taxi driver's description. In fact, nearly every person in Israel who owned a white Ford Escort was looked at, a monumental effort that ultimately led nowhere. Not a single one of those cars could be tied to the crime. It was possible the taxi driver's recollection, while sincere, might have been mistaken or unrelated. Or worse, the killer could have quickly sold or repainted the car once news broke. This lead, which had initially seemed so promising, turned into a dead end. As time dragged on with no arrest, the investigation's intensity never waned. But it did evolve. The original detective team eventually rotated out, and new investigators took over. In fact, 5 separate investigative teams worked the case over the years. Each new team pored over the thick case files, re-interviewed witnesses, and tried fresh angles, determined not to let Noa become just another unsolved statistic. They caught a few tantalizing glimmers of hope over the years. For instance, in 2006, 8 years after the murder, the Jerusalem District Police Commander announced there had been a development in the case. That vague statement caused a flurry of speculation. In reality, police had re-examined links between Noa's murder and other crimes. One theory was that Noa's killer might be a serial offender. Detectives considered whether her murder could be connected to the then unsolved 1993 killing of Vardit Bakernotte, a 27-year-old woman who similarly vanished from a hitchhiking ride and was found murdered in a forest outside Jerusalem. Both cases involved a young woman accepting a ride and ending up raped and killed in a wooded area. However, no definitive forensic link or suspect tie emerged at the time, and that angle fizzled out. For the record, Vardit's case itself would remain unsolved for decades until much later, but that's another story. In their determination to leave no stone unturned, investigators even reached for the stars, literally. In 1999, the Jerusalem police made an unusual request to the United States. Could American intelligence agencies provide spy satellite images from the night of Noa's murder? They hoped that high-resolution military satellites, which routinely photographed the Middle East, might have inadvertently captured something useful. Perhaps images of cars coming or going from the forest, or the exact route taken. It was a long shot, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, NASA's satellite photos yielded no helpful clues. The idea, however, demonstrates how creative and desperate the search had become. At the time, such a move was practically unheard of in a local murder case. It shows a cultural difference. Israeli investigators, facing a wall, were willing to tap into global resources and think outside the box, perhaps inspired by the country's high-tech mindset. Despite Herculean efforts, by the late 2000s the case had gone ice cold. To the public, it seemed that Noa's killer had gotten away with it. For Noa's parents, each passing year without answers was torture. Yet, behind the scenes, the file was never closed. Israel does not impose a statute of limitations on murder, meaning a case stays open indefinitely until solved. Detectives would periodically return to the evidence, especially as forensic technology advanced. And indeed, the seeds of the breakthrough were quietly being planted in police labs and think tanks, even as outwardly the case appeared dormant. One crucial thing police did right from the start was preserve the DNA from the crime scene. Throughout the 2000s, any time a promising suspect emerged in another case, they would compare his DNA to the unknown murderer's profile from Noa's case. They compared dozens of DNA samples from various suspects over the years. But every time, the result was the same: no match. It was deeply frustrating. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but that person's identity remained a ghost. By 2013, more than 15 years had passed. A generation of new cops had joined the force since Noa's murder. The case was something of a legend in the Jerusalem police, a haunting, unsolved crime everyone wished they could crack. In 2013, a new task force was assembled within the central unit to take a fresh look. This wasn't entirely routine. It reflected a conscious decision by police leadership to give Noa's case one last concentrated push. They assigned veteran investigators and even attached a prosecutor from the Jerusalem District Attorney's Office to work with the team from the outset. This collaboration meant they were thinking ahead to how evidence would hold up in court, not just how to find a suspect. The new team in 2013 reviewed every shred of evidence anew. They reread old witness statements, rechecked alibis, and examined physical evidence storage to ensure nothing was overlooked. Crucially, they also embraced new investigative tools and technologies that hadn't been available in 1998. By this time, digital analysis and data mining had come a long way. The team conducted a geographic profiling analysis, essentially mapping known data points, like where Noa was last seen, where her body was found, known residences of people of interest, etc., to look for patterns. They also used advanced analytical systems at National Police Headquarters to cross-reference various databases. One powerful new approach was a kind of criminal profiling meets big data. Investigators compiled a list of characteristics they believed the killer likely had, and then searched for individuals who fit that profile. What might this profile have included? From the case details, likely a male in his late teens to mid-20s in 1998, given Noa's age and scenario. Likely familiar with the area, since he navigated the forest roads at night. Possibly with a history of violence or sexual assault, maybe a soldier or ex-soldier, if the Golani Brigade sticker clue was real. Perhaps someone who owned a car at that time, and who still lived in or frequented Jerusalem. They also considered health and lifestyle factors. For example, had the killer been injured or incarcerated, or left the country after 1998, since the attack stopped? It was a complex mosaic of data, but modern computing allowed police to sift through thousands of names quickly. By slicing and dicing data, age, addresses, car ownership records, military service, criminal records, they generated a short list of potential suspects who statistically had higher likelihood of being connected. And yet, even with these sophisticated techniques, the case might have stayed unsolved if not for a stroke of genomic luck that occurred around the same time. In fact, the key clue that cracked the case did not come from a new witness or a slip-up by the killer. It came from within the killer's own family. By 2014, DNA technology had reached a new frontier. Not only could analysts match a sample to an individual, they could search databases for partial matches that indicate a possible relative. This technique is known as familial DNA matching, and it has been a game-changer in cold cases worldwide. However, it's also legally and ethically thorny, since it involves trawling through people's genetic data, who aren't directly suspects. In Israel at that time, familial searching was cutting edge and not yet fully regulated. It had been used only experimentally in a few cases, and there was debate about privacy implications. For Noa Eyal's case, the investigative team decided it was time to try this new approach. They sought permission to run a familial search on the unknown killer's DNA profile. Essentially, they would ask, does anyone in the national DNA database have enough similarities to suggest they might be a parent, sibling, or child of the person who left DNA at the murder scene? It was a long shot, but one of the only avenues left. The logic: criminals often have family members who might themselves have genetic samples in the database, for example, relatives with criminal records, or who gave DNA as suspects in other cases. Sure enough, in 2014, a dramatic breakthrough occurred. The forensic lab's new familial DNA search flagged a particular sample in the database that was intriguingly close to the Noa case profile. It wasn't an exact match, meaning it wasn't the killer himself, but it showed a strong familial link. According to later reports, the DNA belonged to a male relative of the killer who had been sampled by police the year before. Specifically, a close male relative of our unknown suspect had his DNA collected in 2013, after a run-in with the law. When the lab compared his genetic markers to those from Noa's case, the result lit up. It indicated with high probability that this person was a blood relative of Noa's murderer. Some accounts later indicated the match pointed to the suspect's father as the likely relative in the database. In any event, armed with this knowledge, investigators now essentially had the killer's family tree. They quickly honed in on one family residing in Jerusalem that had a member fitting their suspect profile. Imagine the significance. After 16 years of chasing ghosts, the detectives had a name that had likely never been on their radar. The familial DNA hit led them to the Nachmani family, and in particular to Daniel Nachmani, a man who in 1998 was a 22-year-old living in the remote neighborhood. Who was Daniel Nachmani? On the surface, he did not fit the classic image of a serial predator lurking in society's shadows. By 2014, Daniel, sometimes referred to in early reports as D or Danny due to gag orders, was a 38-year-old family man living in Jerusalem. He was married and had 2 young daughters. He worked as a car electrician at a garage in the Talpiot industrial area of the city. He had no high-profile position or notorious reputation. He was essentially an ordinary Israeli citizen to all appearances. When police quietly background-checked him, they found he'd continued living in the city all these years, moving at some point from Ramat to the Gilo neighborhood. No one had publicly associated him with Noa's murder at all. He was never among the 50-plus suspects interrogated early on. However, under the microscope of the renewed investigation, red flags began to appear in Daniel Nachmani's past. It turned out he did have a criminal history, albeit not a widely known one. When Daniel was 17, 5 years before Noa's murder, he had been charged with committing indecent acts on an 11-year-old girl, a young tourist. Later, he was also arrested on suspicion of molesting a 14-year-old girl. These incidents indicated a disturbing pattern of sexual misconduct with minors, suggesting that even as a teenager, Daniel had predatory tendencies. Although the details of those cases, whether he was convicted or how they were resolved, aren't widely publicized, the mere fact they existed sent chills through the investigative team. If they had known in 1998 that someone with that background lived near Noa, he would have been an obvious suspect. But somehow, Daniel Nachmani's name hadn't come up back then, a combination of luck or misfortune, and possibly the compartmentalized nature of records at the time. Another discovery cemented the investigators' growing certainty that Daniel was their man. Noa Eyal actually knew of Daniel's family. Noa was in the same school class as Daniel's younger sister. This was a startling connection. Jerusalem can feel like a small town, and here was a link that might explain why Noa, waiting for a ride, might have trusted Daniel enough to get in his car if he said something like, "Hey, aren't you in my sister's class? Need a lift home?" Daniel himself was a few years older, but if he recognized Noa, or she him, from the neighborhood, or through his sister, it could have put her at ease. Despite Daniel's later claims that he never met her, they clearly inhabited overlapping circles in Ramat. At minimum, he knew who she was. On top of that, remember the taxi driver's description of a man in a red cap driving a car with stickers? Well, it turns out multiple acquaintances confirmed that back in the late 90s, Daniel Nachmani often wore a red baseball cap. That little fashion detail, which seemed so random, now slotted into place. And what about the car? Investigators dug up that in 1998, Daniel had use of a white Opel Ascona sedan, some reports say Opel Kadett, which might have been easily mistaken for a Ford Escort. Critically, a witness had given a partial license plate number of the suspect's car on the night of the murder, and it turned out to match Daniel's car registration on 5 out of 7 digits. 5 out of 7 is extremely compelling given how many cars are on the road. This was essentially a fingerprint for the vehicle, and Daniel's car fit like a glove. As the pieces fell together, the cold case team could hardly contain their excitement, or their anger. Here was a man who had been hiding in plain sight for 16 years, living a normal life, starting a family of his own, while Noa's family had been shattered. Yet they had to proceed carefully. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence and the familial DNA implication, police needed definitive proof, meaning they needed Daniel's own DNA to directly match the crime scene DNA in order to arrest and charge him. The DNA database had only indicated a relative match. They couldn't convict someone on a maybe relative theory alone. And so, the next step was critical. Get a sample of Daniel Nachmani's DNA without tipping him off. In mid-2014, under utmost secrecy, Jerusalem detectives put Daniel Nachmani under surveillance. They watched his routines, noted his schedule at work and home, and began brainstorming ways to collect a DNA sample surreptitiously. Israeli law, like many others, requires either consent or a court order to take a DNA swab from a suspect, and since they did not want to alert Daniel by formally detaining him yet, they opted for a sneakier route, tailing him until they could collect a viable sample. In one version of events, an officer staged an encounter with Nachmani, offering him a drink or cigarette. In another, they simply observed him until he spat naturally. One way or another, the surveillance team succeeded. Daniel Nachmani spit on the sidewalk during one of the investigators' contrived interactions, and the detectives quickly swabbed the spot after he moved on. The sample was rushed to the crime lab for DNA analysis. The results, as mentioned earlier, came back with a full match. The DNA profile from Daniel's saliva was identical to the DNA found on Noa Eyal's body in 1998. This was the smoking gun. After 16 years of uncertainty, there was now physical, scientific evidence tying Daniel Nachmani to the crime. Investigators also obtained Daniel's historical cell phone records. Incredibly, he had kept the same phone number since the 90s, and analysis showed that his phone pinged a cell tower near Davidka Square around 11:55 p.m. on the night of the murder. In 1998, cell phone tracking was rudimentary, but companies did log which tower a call was routed through. This placed Daniel exactly where Noa was last seen, at exactly the right time. It's worth noting that this cell evidence, while compelling, was later challenged in court due to documentation technicalities, but at the investigative stage, it added confidence. By late October 2014, the police were ready to strike. They planned to arrest Daniel, but they wanted to do it in a way that maximized their advantage. They feared that if they simply picked him up at home, he might clam up, or they might lose an opportunity to glean more information. So they orchestrated a bit of psychological trickery. On the day of the arrest, officers approached Daniel twice. The first time, they briefly detained him and then released him after a short interval, a so-called arrest and release tactic meant to rattle a suspect. Sure enough, after this initial detention, they covertly monitored Daniel's phone calls to see if he would call anyone and say something incriminating or panicky. However, he didn't blurt out any confession on the phone. In fact, he called his wife and calmly told her not to worry, saying nothing about the case. It seemed Daniel was cautious, or perhaps genuinely clueless that the police were onto the old case. The second arrest that day was the real one. In a twist of fate, Daniel was actually at the courthouse that day for his day job. He had gone to the courthouse to pick up a judge's car that he had been working on as a garage mechanic. This put him right in the lion's den. Detectives pounced and arrested him at the entrance to the courthouse in front of stunned onlookers. In one moment, Daniel Nachmani went from a free man to the prime suspect in the infamous murder of Noa Eyal. With Daniel in custody, police wasted no time. They executed search warrants on his home in Gilo and his workplace in Talpiot. They were looking for any remaining evidence, perhaps the item stolen from Noa, if he had kept a trophy, or old photos, diaries, anything that could link him to the scene or show a pattern. After so many years, it wasn't surprising that the searches turned up nothing of note. If there had been physical evidence like bloody clothes or the murder weapon, those were long gone. Daniel's life appeared outwardly normal, with no obvious traces of past violence lying around. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted Daniel with the evidence. One can only imagine his face as they told him, "We have your DNA on the victim." They presented the lab report showing the match. This is the moment many suspects crack, when they realize science has caught them. But Daniel flatly denied everything. He claimed he had never met Noa. had nothing to do with her murder and maintained he was innocent. He even offered to take a polygraph test to prove he was truthful. He wept during the questioning, insisting the police made a mistake. His attorney, a well-known defense lawyer named Yehuda Shushan, arrived and immediately protested his client's innocence, pointing out that dozens of others had been suspected over the years and ultimately cleared. Shushan highlighted that Daniel had a difficult childhood, but was now an exemplary father, and that these accusations hit the family like a bolt from the blue. Indeed, Daniel's wife was reportedly in utter disbelief, saying, "I do not believe it's him. If it turns out it is, I won't stay with him." At the time of the arrest, Daniel's 2 daughters were told only that "Daddy is away overseas," as the family grappled with the shock and shame. The investigators, however, were confident in what they had. They had broken the cold case wide open. On November 11th, 2014, the news was cleared for publication. After 16 years, an arrest had been made in the murder of Noa Eyal. Israeli media flashed bulletins with the headline, "Murder of Noa Eyal solved, thanks to a spit." A succinct and sensational summary. Jerusalem residents were stunned to learn the suspect was one of their own, a local Jerusalem man, 38 years old, married with children, who had lived near Noa at the time. The revelation of how police cracked the case, through an innovative DNA technique and sidewalk surveillance, captivated the public. It was like CSI come to life on the streets of Jerusalem. For Noah's parents, the news was overwhelming. They had endured 17 years of uncertainty, and now suddenly, the embodiment of evil has been given a face, as they put it. They expressed cautious relief, thanking the police and hoping that justice would finally be done. Yet they also asked for privacy, needing time to process this new reality where a suspect, a real person, was identified as the killer of their daughter. The family had been through so much. In their statement, they mentioned being flooded by painful memories of those days 17 years ago. Now they steeled themselves for the next phase, a legal battle to ensure this man would answer for his crime. In Israel, serious criminal trials, including murder, are conducted not with juries, but before professional judges. Daniel Nachmani's case would be heard in the Jerusalem District Court by a panel of 3 judges, as is customary for a homicide trial. After his arrest, formal charges were prepared. In November 2014, the District Attorney's Office filed an indictment against Daniel for the rape and murder of Noa Eyal. They also included charges of committing an indecent act, essentially sexual assault, in the course of the crime. Prosecutors even initially tried to include evidence of Daniel's prior bad acts, the earlier molestation incidents, under a legal doctrine known as similar fact evidence, attempting to show a pattern of targeting young girls. However, such evidence is typically tricky to admit, and the focus remained on the crime at hand. At Daniel's first court appearances, a gag order on his identity was lifted, so the media could name him. Seeing him in the courtroom was surreal for those who remembered the case. Here was the alleged murderer, not a shadowy figure, but a balding, unremarkable man in glasses, escorted in handcuffs. Public reaction ranged from anger to morbid curiosity. How had this man lived among us normally all these years? Some neighbors from his current neighborhood were in disbelief. Others who knew him back in the 90s quietly recalled that he had been a bit of a troubled youth. As the trial commenced, prosecutors laid out the narrative of that night in 1998. Daniel, cruising downtown in his car, spotted Noa alone and offered a ride, exploiting the fact that she vaguely knew his family. Once she was in the car, he diverted from the route to Ramot and drove into the forest. There, he attacked her. Court documents described how he sexually assaulted Noa, including acts of rape and sodomy, while she resisted. To silence her and eliminate the witness to his crime, he then bludgeoned her to death with a heavy object, crushing her skull. This brutality, the prosecution emphasized, showed premeditation and extreme cruelty. Noah's last moments were a nightmare of terror and pain, and Daniel's actions merited the harshest punishment. The state's case rested heavily on forensic and circumstantial evidence, since there were no direct eyewitnesses to the murder. The DNA evidence was front and center, experts from the Israel Police Forensic Science Institute testified that Daniel Nachmani's DNA matched the semen and biological traces found on Noa's body with virtually 100% certainty. They explained the novel familial DNA technique that led to Daniel in the first place, which was a fascinating point for the court. It was one of the first times such evidence was used in an Israeli courtroom. The defense seized on this, arguing that the police had effectively conducted an unauthorized genetic dragnet, infringing on privacy. This would later form the backbone of the defense's legal argument that the method of finding Daniel was unlawful. Prosecutors also brought in Daniel's former girlfriend from the late 90s, who delivered intriguing testimony. She recounted that Daniel had a habit of taking her to remote forest for intimate encounters around that time. This demonstrated that he knew the area well and used it as a secluded spot, exactly what one would expect of Noa's killer. It also directly contradicted any claim that Daniel had never been to that forest. In fact, during the investigation, Daniel had initially told police he'd never set foot in remote forest. His own girlfriend's testimony undermined that. Then came the taxi driver and other witnesses. The taxi driver, who had reported the girl getting into a white car with a red-capped driver, testified to what he saw. While he understandably couldn't positively identify Daniel so many years later, his description from 1998 was documented and matched Daniel's known car and habit of wearing a red cap. Additional witnesses from Daniel's social circle in 1998 testified that he frequently wore a red cap, reinforcing that detail. And crucially, police had tracked down the registration of Daniel's car from 1998 and matched it against the partial plate number noted in the case file. As mentioned before, a near match of 5 out of 7 digits. An investigator walked the judges through how that initial witness report of the plate, which back in the day had been like finding a needle in a haystack, suddenly made sense when Daniel emerged as a suspect. Moreover, the prosecution presented the cell phone evidence. The record showing Daniel's mobile phone active near Davidka Square at 23:55 on February 22, 1998, essentially placing him at the scene of abduction when Noa disappeared. They even noted that Daniel curiously kept the same phone number all these years, an unusual thing, but it inadvertently helped place him at the crime scene. The defense later fought hard to exclude this cell phone record on technical grounds, claiming it lacked proper certification from the phone company. The court ultimately did rule that particular document inadmissible due to authentication issues, since it lacked an official letterhead or clear provenance. But by then the DNA evidence was already overwhelming on its own. All these pieces formed a robust puzzle pointing to Daniel. The defense strategy, led by attorney Yehuda Shushan, was to cast doubt and raise technical objections. Shushan argued that most of the evidence is technical, implying that it could be flawed or misinterpreted. He insisted Daniel had no connection to Noa, and that it's unreasonable to expect anyone to remember exactly where they were on a random night 16 years ago, suggesting that if Daniel made inconsistent statements about ever being in the forest or downtown, it was due to normal memory lapses, not guilt. The defense also hammered on the legality of the DNA evidence. They contended that Israeli law at the time did not explicitly allow familial DNA searches in the criminal database, and thus police overstepped their authority by conducting essentially a genetic fishing expedition. They also argued that collecting Daniel's discarded saliva without a warrant constituted an unlawful search of his person. These were novel questions for the court: how to balance investigative innovation against individual rights, and they foreshadowed a battle that would continue on appeal. Notably, Daniel never took the stand in his own defense, as is his right, but he did speak out at his sentencing later. Throughout the trial, he remained mostly quiet, often shaking his head as evidence was presented, as if in disbelief. His family, particularly his wife, attended and looked visibly distressed. It was hard to reconcile the image of Daniel as a loving father and husband with the monster described in court. But the DNA didn't lie. After a lengthy trial, these things move slower in practice than in retelling. The moment of truth arrived. In January 2019, 21 years after Noa's murder, the Jerusalem District Court delivered its verdict. The panel of judges found Daniel Nachmani guilty of murder and of committing a sexual assault, sodomy, on Noa Eyal. They acquitted him of the specific charge of rape, likely because by legal definition, the evidence didn't conclusively prove vaginal rape in addition to sodomy, perhaps due to degradation of evidence or the specifics of the assault. However, this did not significantly change the gravity of the crime. He was convicted of the intentional killing coupled with a violent sexual offense, which carries essentially the same weight. The judge's written verdict emphasized the overwhelming forensic evidence and the consistency of the witness testimony linking Daniel to the crime. They had no doubt that the right man had been caught. Noa's family, who had sat through the trial hearing the painful details of their daughter's final moments, wept quietly as the verdict was read. Outside the courtroom, her father told reporters that the evil person who took Noa's life has no right to walk freely, expressing a sense of relief that order was restored by the conviction. Yet he poignantly noted that for the family there would never truly be comfort or relief. Their beloved Noa was gone forever. Still, this was justice, and it mattered. Daniel Nachmani, however, was defiant even in defeat. At his sentencing hearing in April 2019, he erupted in anger at the judges. He shouted, "I am innocent, and you, the court, are doing whatever you want. I'm no monster. I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit." He complained that he had remained silent for years as the media made him out to be a monster, and despite police trampling him, he never confessed. He even said he felt sorry for Noa's family's loss, but insisted the police should continue searching for the real killer, implying he was a scapegoat. The judges were not swayed by this outburst. In Israeli courts, judges often allow a convicted person to speak before sentencing, but here they cut Daniel short, perhaps finding his tirade self-serving and disruptive. His lawyers protested, saying the court should have let him finish, but it likely would not have changed the outcome. The sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment for the murder, plus 16 additional years for the sexual assault. The extra years were to be served consecutively, not concurrently, a clear message of the severity of his crimes. Additionally, Daniel was ordered to pay 258,000 shekels, around $70,000, in compensation to Noa's family. In Israel, a life sentence means the prisoner will spend the rest of their life in prison, unless a special parole board commutes the sentence after a minimum of many decades, or a presidential pardon intervenes, which is rare for such crimes. In Daniel's case, the court explicitly stated that his life term must be at least 40 years behind bars before any possibility of release. Given he was in his early 40s at sentencing, that effectively means he would be in his 80s before even a theoretical chance of parole. In essence, a life behind bars. The courtroom drama wasn't quite over. As is his right, Daniel appealed his conviction to the Israeli Supreme Court, which doubles as the highest appellate court. His lawyers focused on the legality of the DNA evidence. They argued that at the time of the investigation, there was no clear statutory authorization for familial DNA searches, and thus using that method violated Daniel's right to privacy and should be deemed an illegal search. They contended that if his arrest was predicated on an unlawful search, the familial DNA and the spat sample, then the core evidence should be thrown out, a fruit of the poisonous tree argument, akin to what one might hear in American courts. They also reiterated that taking his saliva from the street without a warrant was an illegal seizure of bodily evidence. This appeal was closely watched, as it had implications for investigative techniques in Israel. In March 2021, the Supreme Court of Israel delivered its decision, firmly rejecting Daniel Nachmani's appeal. The justices upheld the conviction and the sentence. In their ruling, they addressed the DNA issues. They found that police did not violate the law by conducting a familial DNA search, noting that existing law allowed comparing investigation evidence with database entries for criminal identification purposes. Essentially, they gave a green light to this method, which set an important precedent in Israeli jurisprudence. They also ruled that collecting Daniel's saliva from a public place did not constitute an illegal bodily search. The reasoning was similar to other jurisdictions. When you spit on the ground in public, you abandon that sample, so police picking it up is no different from collecting a dropped hair or a cigarette butt. It doesn't invade the body or require consent. With these findings, the Supreme Court ensured that the evidence remained valid and Daniel's conviction stood. For Noa's family, the Supreme Court decision was the final closure in legal terms. It ended the appeals and confirmed that the man responsible would remain behind bars. In a way, it was also a validation of the police's relentless efforts and innovative tactics. The family expressed that while justice was done, what comfort can there really be? Their daughter was not coming back, but at least the Naam, the Hebrew word for the concept of justice or retribution, was achieved. The resolution of Noa Eyal's murder case stands as a landmark in Israeli crime history. It showcased the marriage of dogged traditional detective work with cutting-edge science. The use of familial DNA in 2014 was a pioneering move in Israel, paralleling what was happening elsewhere in the world. For example, the US would later famously use it to catch the Golden State Killer in 2018. This case helped establish legal acceptance for such methods in Israel. It also underlined the importance of maintaining and expanding DNA databases. The random chance that a relative of the killer got his DNA taken for an unrelated reason was the linchpin. If that hadn't happened, Daniel might still be free today. Now, Israel's DNA database and policies around familial searches are more developed, partly thanks to this case setting a precedent. In the end, justice in Noa's case arrived late, but decisively. It's a story of hope for every cold case that sits gathering dust, a testament that someday, with enough persistence and perhaps a bit of scientific serendipity, the truth will out. Noa Eyal's story will be remembered in Israel not just for its tragedy, but for the incredible journey to solve it, proving that time and truth can work hand in hand to bring a murderer to justice. Thank you so much for listening. As a new podcast, we very much appreciate your support. If you're interested in rarely heard global murder cases like this one, we encourage you to give us a follow, or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app. If we may be so bold, it would help us out a lot. See you next time.